Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching NRCOP. My name's Ian Kaplan and this webinar is brought to you by NRCOP, the National Regulators Community of Practice, on behalf of ANSOC. You may be watching us in Australia or New Zealand or even further afield internationally. And you may be watching the live or in fact the recorded version of this webinar, which appears on ANSOC's YouTube channel within 14 days of transmission. Wherever you are and whenever you are, you're very welcome here. With all of that in mind, and the fact that we've got people watching us from so many different parts of the world, I want to say a special welcome and take this opportunity to welcome and acknowledge any First Peoples here from anywhere today and pay my respects to them and their forebears. We honour your wisdom, we honour your stewardship of traditional lands and your customs. They indeed enrich us all. Welcome. This programme is brought to you from New Zealand, which is the home of the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, GREG. I'm having the privilege of representing GREG at NRCOP, and I'd like also to add this greeting in Te Reo Māori. Tēnei te mihi mahana kia koutou, aha kaua kowhai, aha kaua no hea, no mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui. Tēnā koutou katoa. This is a warm greeting to you all, regardless of who you are and where you're from. Welcome to this meeting and greetings to you all. It was that great regulatory practitioner, that international regulatory practitioner, Sir Cliff Richard, who once said, "It's so funny that we don't talk anymore." But it's no joke when regulators don't talk and don't communicate to those they regulate or the wider community from which they derive their social license to regulate. And that could be because of bad comms or indeed no comms. Telling the story properly is very much what this webinar is about, because it's one thing, as Sir Cliff might say, to be wired for sound, but it's a completely different point if you are indeed wired for sound, but you're not making the right noises, and they could be damaging noises, as I say, to your regulated parties and indeed the community that gives the social license to regulate. So how do we do good comms? And before we even ask that question, do good comms really matter? We're very well placed today because our special guest who joins us, Michelle Bryne from the Victorian Essential Services Commission, and she's the head of strategic communication there, is very well placed professionally to deal. After a career as a successful journalist in Sydney's competitive commercial radio environment in the 1990s, Michelle traded the headphones for a flak jacket to go to the defence, to leap to the defence of local government, and then later successful stints in New South Wales, elsewhere, infrastructure, public health. Victoria has been the next beneficiary as well in terms of gambling awareness, and now, as I've mentioned, the Essential Services Commission. Michelle's not just armed with a flak jacket, she has a master's in communications and a proven track record of that kind of multi-layered approach that really deals across platforms in terms of stakeholder management, reputation management and engagement management. And we're going to go to Michelle in just a moment to hear more from her. But before we do that, I thought I'd just add a few remarks, as it were, from my perspective across the ditch. The home agency that I belong to, that's very kindly seconded me to GREG in New Zealand, is Inland Revenue New Zealand. Inland Revenue and tax administrations all around the planet have at least a privilege in terms of communicating to this extent. They generally don't have to tell people who they are or what they do for a living. It's obvious. But the trick is to actually communicate how they do it well. And Inland Revenue, like any other regulator, possibly in some ways more than any other regulator, is not exempt from the requirement to really project the nature of the integrity of its regulatory system through good communications and clear communications. In New Zealand's case, this is not just a matter of public record, it's a matter of law. New Zealand's Tax Administration Act 1994 at Section 6 has a very explicit concept of the integrity of a tax system. Public officials connected to it are mandated to protect it. And definitionally within the statute, the integrity of a tax system also includes taxpayers' perceptions of that integrity, which goes straight to the heart of a communications approach. Allied to that, our Chief Executive, the Commissioner of Inland Revenue, has statutory responsibilities for the care and management of the tax system, of which voluntary compliance and its promotion is an integral part. Now, voluntary compliance, and I look nervously down because I'm about to say the C word, if for not all regulators, is critical for us and the right messaging that leads to it, because certainly in our revenues case, whatever legislation calls those it regulates taxpayers, we at Inland Revenue, and it's very much part of our story, call them customers. And as I say, to some, that is perhaps more an expletive than an explicative. And I'm not going to take that debate any further here, members of the audience, but I will give some of the hundreds of you watching us perhaps just a moment to pause to do that sharp intake of breath if you're one side of a debate. Whichever side of the debate you are, though, it must be common ground, surely, that in order for this not to be mere guff, if we are going to call the people we regulate customers, there's an implied course of dealing within the law that flows from that, an implied course of fair dealing, and an implied course of clarity, clear, simple, appropriate communication. From my employer's perspective, as a tax authority, there's another C word that comes into play here, and our communications practitioners, my colleagues who I work with, are tirelessly mindful about that, and this is community. To the extent it was ever the case that we're communicating with the community, and it really is air quotes there, members of the audience, it's not the approach anymore. There are communities, lots of different communities through which different nuances, and I'm sure you'll empathise with this, many of you watching this webinar, and the messaging and the nature of the messaging that goes to those different communities will be attenuated according to those requirements. It may well be that it's a more personal touch online. It may well be more advertising just in terms of web messaging, or it may be particular social media advertising. It may well be that the message to one community within the range of communities is actually so far different to the messaging to another community that there's almost an antagonism, and what's good for one is profoundly unhelpful to the other. Being institutionally mindful about that is complicated, and it doesn't detract from the need, and my colleagues at Inland Revenue tirelessly, as I say, work with this to make sure that throughout all of this, one evergreen proposition that hasn't changed in the world is that the communication has to be clear and simple and reach its audience in the appropriate way. So there it is. Michelle's got all that to deal with, and we're going to welcome Michelle in just one moment. But before I do that, I'm just going to say it is a family show, members of the audience, and you are invited to participate by asking questions, by making comments. Well, there it is, members of the audience, a very warm welcome, and a very warm welcome to you, Michelle. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you to ANZOG for this opportunity to talk about my favourite subject, why good comms matters, but do they? I'll get to the meaning of the brick wall first, but I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on all of the lands wherever you are today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging who may be with us. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge the connection that Indigenous Australians hold to country and culture, particularly at this time of great uncertainty. A little bit about me. I grew up in a small country town, Lithgow, New South Wales. Lithgow has 3 claims to fame. It was the birthplace of Australian iron and steel industry. It was the hometown of John Doyle, AM, of Roy and HG fame, and Olympic gold medalist Marjorie Jackson, aka the Lithgow Flash. There wasn't much to do in Lithgow for the 4th daughter of a local baker and a nurse, but lucky for me, I didn't need much, just a book and a quiet corner to disappear to for hours on end. Stories were my world, and I was lucky enough to turn my passion for telling stories into a career in radio journalism in Sydney and Newcastle, as Ian mentioned. But lugging around a heavy recorder, a microphone and a mobile phone the size of a house brick lost its appeal after nearly a decade, and I swapped the microphone for a flak jacket in defence of local government, and my career as a strategic communication specialist began. A decade in local government gave way to big infrastructure, followed by big health. Then, after a move to Victoria, a stint in responsible gambling, and now economic regulation. But the common thread, stories, being able to communicate ideas in a way that resonates with the intended audience, was common. But is it enough? Is good comms enough? And the answer, of course, is no. The reason why good comms alone, even well-planned, targeted, well-executed and delivered comms that arrive at just the right time using the right channel for the intended audience isn't enough, is there's simply too much competition. According to the tech world, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are produced by humans every single day. Now, I don't know what a quintillion is, but I think it's a lot. 463 exabytes of data are generated or will be generated each day by humans by 2025. That's the prediction. 95 million photos and videos are shared on Instagram, 306.4 billion emails are sent, and 500 million tweets are made every day, even without the former President of the United States. So what does this mean? It means you can't rely on comms alone to make an impact. Your comms has to be lived. You can't rely on comms to suffice in a world where the sheer volume of data being generated is increasing exponentially. But fear not, my friends, good communication and telling stories is a big part of the answer. But the answer is not comms, but reputation. Does a regulator need a good reputation? Can you measure the value of a good reputation? The corporate world certainly thinks so, with many studies showing the value of a good reputation can be equivalent to 40 or more than 50% of the market value of a company. And this guy thinks so. And he famously said, we can afford to lose money, even a lot of money, but we can't afford to lose reputation, even a shred of reputation. Warren Buffett, the world's fourth richest man as of December 2020. But does a good reputation matter to a regulator? That was the question in 2017 at the Essential Services Commission. We set out to identify what benefits, if any, there are for a regulator of having a good reputation. Does having a good reputation matter? I remember that day clearly. I was still relatively new to the Commission and its executive team, and this was my first time leading a workshop of the executive. I knew that that day, more than any other, I needed a win. Lucky for me, I had the wind at my back, and we came up with what I think is a great list. A good reputation can open doors, creating opportunities to build cooperation and collaboration that extends your reach and influence. A good reputation promotes constructive dialogue. Stakeholders, including the businesses, or especially the businesses you regulate, will take you more seriously. A good reputation encourages alliances, partnerships, again, increasing your sphere of influence, increasing your reach in marketing terms. A good reputation buys you time in a crisis. It means when the you-know-what hits the fan, you are more likely to be given the benefit of the doubt, an opportunity to make good, to apologise, and for your apology to be accepted without too much damage to your reputation. There are many benefits of having a good reputation, but perhaps one of the most important for a regulator is, as Ian said, it underpins your licence to operate. Let's face it, regulators with a good reputation are rarely decommissioned, if you'll forgive the pun. So now I had executive buy-in. Reputation, not just comms, was important. But what can you do if your reputation is not good? Can you change it? The answer is yes, you can, once you understand the drivers of reputation. There are many models that attempt to show the drivers of reputation, but this is the only one, please tell me if I'm wrong there, that has been tried and tested in a non-commercial environment over a long-term period, backed by years of data, showed if a local authority, this was in the UK, consistently and well carried out a relatively small set of core actions over time, you can improve your reputation. It shows your reputation is made up of a range of factors, some of which are outside your control, your direct control, but many you can control or at least influence. Things like how a constituent is treated when they walk in the door, call on the phone or contact you online. What is their direct experience of you? Direct communication or managed communication and media coverage are a factor, as is the quality of your work. What you do does matter. But also perceptions about the value of what you do and the quality of your work are also a factor. The only one you have no direct control over is a person's personal circumstances. Are they vulnerable? Are they in hardship? Are they unemployed? You can't directly affect these, but you can be aware of them and adapt to make sure that your comms and engagement with them is effective and that their needs are taken on board. This model ultimately led to a nationwide project implemented by local authorities, imaginatively called the UK Reputation Project. Lasting from 2005 to 2013 and involving most local councils across the UK, the project focused on a series of core actions divided between communication activities and environmental services. It included doing what we would think of as really basic core communications, sending out newsletters to tell residents what their local council was doing for them, advertising a helpline, managing the media and brand, and good internal communication so you can identify issues early. Along with basic core services, cleaning up grotty areas, branding council cleaning services so people recognised them and gave them credit when they were out and about, and protecting the environment. Over 8 years, the percentage of residents who said they highly valued their local authority doubled, and trust in local government increased from 52% to 65%. This was at a time when there were service cuts and increasing charges. In 2013, the campaign moved from tactics to strategy, adding community engagement to the mix, and it made a measurable difference. So what's this got to do with an economic regulator? I use this model as a tool to show staff, executives and commissioners that if you focus on what's driving your reputation and develop a response that speaks to these drivers, it puts you behind the wheel. There's one more step, and my formula for turning these ideas about managing reputation into strategy has underpinned our work at the Commission for the last 4.5 years. And this is my formula. Channels plus culture, then content. Because communications alone will not shift reputation. You need to live it and breathe it across the whole organisation. Because your comms team is not the only team that is connecting with your stakeholders. Every time someone writes a letter, a report or answers the phone, they have an opportunity to improve or damage your reputation with an individual or a group of stakeholders. So as well as the formula, you need a roadmap to guide the organisational shift needed at every level. Lucky for us, the Reputation Institute, the think tank behind the world's leading reputation index, RepTrak, has one. This map is based on a survey of almost 300 of the world's global reputation leading businesses. It's a strategic roadmap to managing your organisational reputation. You'll not be surprised to hear it starts with working out where you are and where you want to be. So that's where I started. Phase 1, exploration and business rationale. exploration. I conducted a desktop review of existing channels, our communications channels and engagement channels, and developed a let's start here strategy. This was in the absence of any data at that time. It was a simple review of what I could see before me and my assessment of what was working and what wasn't working purely from a professional perspective. And year one was about getting the basics right, establishing standards and the value of good communication that was planned, targeted, audience focused and effective. I was gaining buy-in across the organisation, starting with the easy wins. Evaluating channels for effectiveness and efficiency, reviewing the organisation's needs, establishing a centralised communication team so we had more control of what was happening, developing new standards for writing and web content and media, and establishing a small set of performance metrics so we knew where we were going. We also established what we call our reputation attributes. We developed our reputation attributes, a brand workshop, if you like, to identify what we wanted to be known for. I still remember that day too. Another workshop with the executive team, huge sticky posters on the wall, and a mixture of curious and skeptical senior executives. But I'd done my homework. I brought the receipts and I had the support of my CEO and chair. So we developed our reputation attributes and then we tested and refined them with the whole organisation. The words themselves were not that important, although they are words that we repeat. It was more about getting buy-in from across the organisation that this is what we wanted to be known for, giving people the tools to call it out when they saw that we weren't living up to our brand. So now we knew where we wanted to be, we needed to find out where we were objectively. Not just hearsay, not just what we were hearing from our favourite stakeholders or the ones who would praise us in public. So we measured our reputation with stakeholders and the results were surprising to some. What was clear from this very first survey was that despite being regarded as an effective economic regulator that was making good decisions, our stakeholders had put us at average to well below average across all key measures. From an overall satisfaction rate of a disappointing 58% to an even more disappointing 53% for outcomes and decisions. What was also obvious, the columns to the right are by division, and I deliberately haven't named them because that's not important. The results were not consistent across all groups. The gap between the highest ranked group and the lowest was, on some measures, as much as 40 to 58%. For those who are familiar with this type of survey, there's often a spread between the better ranked and lower ranked groups. How else do you work out who's doing well and who needs to do more work? But in 20 years of doing this kind of survey, I've never seen a spread like this. It was a clarion call to action. What you also can't see here was that stakeholders, regardless of whether they were from the regulated businesses or the consumer groups or our friends in government, they were all consistent about which groups were doing well and which weren't. So it wasn't a matter of one group was more or less popular with a particular sector. There was a difference between the teams that was quite marked. These results were enough to get everyone's attention. We needed to do more than just tinker around the edges and do more comms. We needed to get strategic. We needed more than a communication strategy, more than an engagement strategy. We needed a reputation strategy that spread responsibility and accountability for our reputation across the entire organisation. So, armed with the knowledge of where we were, the next step was to focus on the culture part of our reputation journey. So we developed, on the back of those survey results a response plan that spread responsibility and accountability for addressing the shortcomings that were pulling down our reputation to the division level, not the comms team. Although, of course, we had plenty to do supporting the comms revolution that was taking place across the organisation. We were managing an exponential increase in the amount of managed communication, including doubling our media outputs, getting the website in order. That's a whole story for another day. Conducting training to support our new written communication standards, and rolling out plain English training to the entire organisation. Standards mattered. And then we also started a review of our consultation charter. And did I mention there was only 3 of us? But before I get to the next stage, I want to revisit our reputation roadmap. We'd completed phase 1, exploration and business rationale, and also phase 2, management and measurement framework development. Now, after nearly 2 years and some really positive results from a second follow-up survey with some marked improvement across all measures, we were looking squarely at phase 3, business planning integration. So in 2018-19, we went back to our channels. The initial 2016-17 review had barely scratched the surface. It was about putting out fires, and it focused on action by the comms team. This time we needed to go deeper. We needed to engage the entire organisation in taking responsibility for our comms. We needed longer term strategies, and we wanted to stretch the limits a little. So we developed a 2-year digital strategy that included replacing what was then a still fairly new website, but it had not met expectations, and we established a social media presence. The most important step was we developed a stakeholder engagement framework to bring our engagement practice up to scratch. And we put nearly 100 staff through engagement skills training. And then we checked in again to see if it was working. We again conducted our reputation survey with hundreds of our key stakeholders, and the results were again a positive endorsement of our effort and our approach. Large and sustained increases across all key measures, particularly communication and stakeholder consultation, but also recognition of improvements to processes and interactions with staff, because these, as a direct experience of our stakeholders, were drivers of our reputation. So good comms wasn't the only thing we were doing. We were doing a lot of other things as well. More importantly, if you look at this view, the overall results had improved, but the gap between the lowest ranking division and the highest ranking division had shrunk significantly. And even the measures that were still red indicating more than 10% below the average had improved so much, and they'd still improved. In fact, those in the red had improved by close to or more than 10% and up to 16%. So to revisit our reputation roadmap, we were now at phase 4, cross-functional implementation and accountability. Comms and engagement does not belong to the comms team. It belongs to the entire organisation. Every division at the Commission has a communication and engagement plan embedded in their annual operational plan, including reputation measures. And importantly, a lot of it doesn't involve the comms team, except as an advisor, a guide, a standards check, or to manage the external comms channels. But the divisions take a lot of responsibility and pride in managing their own reputation. To the point we now have staff coming to us with new ideas and initiatives, and sometimes we hide. No, seriously, we hide. Now on to year 3, a year of consolidation, review and reinforcement. Our new engagement framework was audited, and it had improved things a lot, but it still was missing the mark and there was some backsliding. So as a result, we increased support by establishing a new lead practitioner role, expanding our training program and establishing online consultation as the norm. We ran a major advertising campaign to promote awareness of energy reform and developed a new intranet to ensure staff had access to all the information, tools and training, including communication and engagement tools that they needed. And we continued to focus on improving our channels, developing capacity and capability across the Commission in core skills, including plain English, engagement, writing for the web, social media management. And we added a new intranet to promote and reinforce the open communication culture. By now you're wondering, well, when do we get to the stories or content in my formula? Fear not, we have been telling stories along the way. But developing focused and effective content has not been our focus to date. And the reason for this is I'm convinced, after 20+ years, that until you have the right channels and channel management strategies in place, until you've made the cultural shift to an open communication culture, focusing on content will be wasted effort, because you won't have the right channels in place or the supporting culture to make sure that your content, your stories land well. There's a saying in advertising that nothing will kill a bad product faster than good advertising. So now, 2021, 2022 is the time to focus on content. We've developed a new reputation strategy, a 3-year reputation strategy with 3 key themes. We are the strong regulator. We are tough but fair with enforcement action. We're the connected regulator. We are plugged in and at the centre of what matters. We are the compassionate and visionary regulator. We are looking after some of the world's biggest problems. Vulnerability and climate change are on everyone's mind, and they're on ours too. We've developed key messages and streams to embed these in our communication planning. We've even matched our commissioners to a theme so that we can increase our visibility and reach using them. We're working on a themed media calendar to ensure our key messages don't get drowned out by business as usual comms, which is often the case with busy comms team. They're so busy churning out the messages that they have to get out there that the strategic messages get lost. We've developed a new digital strategy with a focus on increasing the accessibility of our digital content. We've expanded our writing training program to improve the quality of our publications. So now we're focusing on stories, on content, and we are so keen to take this to the next level. So we're working on phase 5. Full integration into long-term strategy and investments. So now you've indulged my walk down memory lane, it's finally time to reveal. What's the deal with the brick wall? It's a metaphor, of course. I'm a comms person. In my mind, your reputation is a brick wall. It's a defence, it's protection against the elements and damaging winds. It's built one brick at a time. And it's only as strong as the foundations that it's built on and the mortar that holds the bricks together. Your communication and engagement channels are your foundation. Your content, your stories are the bricks, and your mortar is the culture that holds it all together. A word of warning, like any brick wall, it can be brought down by a wrecking ball if you're not paying attention to its integrity. Thank you.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely terrific. And like all really, really stellar presentations, there is so much to choose from. Everyone will have a series of favourite bits. I can already see, members of the audience, that there are loads of questions coming through on Slido. Please do take a look at them, and it's highly democratised, so please do continue your voting, because we have a lot of questions to get through. Interestingly, and given Given the age in which we live, I can't ignore a democratic vote. Can we have more Cliff Richard references, please? I will just say that with 2.5 quintillion bytes of data, there's no time for a summer holiday or even any mistletoe and wine, because we might get those misunites in our audiences, and that's all you're going to hear from my inner Sir Clifford. One of the things, of the many things, Michelle, what you were talking about was the idea that it's pervasive and organisationally that everybody should be involved in comms. Comms and engagement, you said, belongs to all, not just the comms team. Before we go to our other colleagues in the audience, can you just say a little bit more about that? Because I'm not sure that everybody necessarily does that.
Think about walking into a coffee shop and purchasing a cup of coffee. If you walk in and you are treated dismissively at the counter, and then you're handed a bad coffee and it was more expensive than your average, you're not going back to that coffee shop. Now, in the regulatory world, certainly with the businesses that we operate with, our regulated businesses don't have a choice about dealing with us. What they do have a choice is how they react when we ask them to do something. So if their experience of us, from a phone call, from a letter, from an email, in a workshop, is negative, or they perceive it as negative, and the comms team's not been anywhere near this interaction, then how likely are they to respond positively to a request for information that isn't backed up by a, Section 37 request for information notice, or that hasn't been delivered in a timely fashion? You just get more fight on your hands. So that's where having a good reputation that's built on every single interaction of your organisation, it affects how efficient, effective, your sphere of influence, the likelihood of pushback. So the importance of having everybody understand their role in your reputation, it's anybody who works in a shop, a well-run shop anyway, knows that when they are the face of the brand, when people walk in, when a regulated business comes to you and interacts with a member of staff, you are the brand of the organisation. You are representing the organisation, and what you do in those moments matters.
Absolutely, and I think sound thoughts there, Michelle. I'm already getting requests for the just on a logistical level. Will your slides be available after the webinar, please?
I understand that this is definitely possible.
Lovely.
Yes.
That's great. That's great. So we'll go to the next question. Please, members of the audience, says keep the votes coming through, keep the questions coming through. I'm going to just group a couple of questions together here, Michelle. What's your advice, we're asked, to regulators? Very popular question is, who need to communicate their public value when they're highly technical or even obscure? And I'm going to bolt on a question that appears below that, which is, if we can't even afford our own comms team, what about those who are dealing with the obscure, or that not necessarily dealing with the obscure, but simply don't have a comms capability of their own?
That is a very good question, and I know that the comms workforce is relatively small. If I could turn the question on its head and say, can you afford not to? If a tree falls in the forest, did anyone hear it? If you put out a decision and nobody can understand it, did you really make a decision? Your sphere, your ability to influence, your ability to get buy-in, your reach is directly tied to how different audiences, including those who will understand the technical aspects, but different audiences can engage with your content. We have gone for our best example here, and credit to Marcus Crudden, who is our Director of Price Monitoring and Regulation here, because he's been living this for years.
Yeah.
The water part of the Essential Services Commission used to put out 100 plus page performance reports and decisions. Their average reports are now down to 20 to 30 pages, and they also make use of infographics and one or two page fact sheets. and they're at the top of our tree. I'll give away that they are, in terms of reputation, our highest performing division. And that's because they live and breathe the fact that they need to translate complex information into simple, accessible information. And you know, it's embedded in the team. They're the first ones to line up for plain English writing. They're you know, they're really, they work with my team incredibly well. So, you know, if you don't translate your information, Plain English Foundation New South Wales, shout out to them. I've done many Plain English courses over the years. I've run a few, but the Plain English Foundation, for those who are in New South Wales, they're the best I've seen. They're fantastic. So you've got to train people down to that level. We've trained everybody in the organisation. We're playing catch up now because 2020 got in the way, but everybody in the organisation who writes has to do the plain English training.
And I think linked to that, Michelle, thank you. It's one of those where, coming from a tax authority, we're certainly no strangers to the need to translate and make things quite meaningful for a range of audiences. And Sir Ernest Gowers, the English author of Plain Words just after the Second World War, and I think it's such a popular book, his great-granddaughter has actually reissued it, and it was in as much as the Treasury can have a bestseller, I think it's the closest it's ever got. Be short, be simple, be human was, I think, what he'd said, and it sounds like that thought's never gone away. With all that in mind, there are still those who would say, and I think you've partly answered this, Michelle, but often comms, one of the popular questions here, is an afterthought in regulatory practice. Why is it, you think, perhaps, that certain regulators just don't see community education as a vital part of their ops? I mean, they're in the business of harm prevention.
I can't speak on behalf of their motivations. I can only speak to the success that we've had as an organisation in taking this stuff seriously, and some parts of the organisation are well ahead of others. If I can again go back to, you know, the water division, but also our local government area. When we were first given responsibility for administering the rate cap in Victoria, and the local government part of our work was established, that team knew that educating councils was going to be key. It was a very controversial thing. Councils didn't want it. So they put a lot of effort into educating the sector. Now, that didn't mean that the sector was happy about rate capping, but it did mean that they worked with us to make it an efficient activity and an effective exercise. And we, you know, and it took that team years to build that up, but it came from a place of, we've got a job to do, let's work together. And they lived and breathed that. So I can't speak to why some regulators don't take industry engagement and industry education seriously. All I can point to is there are many examples, and obviously well beyond the Commission as well, where when you do it, it works and it makes your life easier.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those who do want to do it, do you have any recommendations, to the extent you haven't dealt with this one already, Michelle, for how to uplift comms capability in a regulator? No substitute for having a comms team, but for individuals who don't have a comms degree, is there an online course you recommend? And I think this question is really dealing with perhaps those who aren't specifically in the comms unit. Is there something that they can take that's effectively generic and off the shelf, but gets them close to the sort of messaging training that you're looking at?
No, but there's a business idea. Thank you.
I'll take 25%.
I'm not aware of one. I mean, there are lots of conferences, and they are pitched at comms professionals, but they're also pitched at project managers. We put a lot of our, like I said, we do in IAP2, the International Association for Public Practitioners. We put everybody who is a project manager through one day of that 5-day IAP2 accredited course. So that's on the engagement front. We put everybody through plain English training. We offer facilitation skills training for running meetings to anybody who is doing that kind of work. So we have a range of training programs that we run, that we are provided externally. We reinforce that with internal training and booster training, we call it, and reminder training. All of that is out there, but if you were somebody who you recognise that communication is important, go along to, there are many communication seminars out there that will give you the basics, and they'll talk about how to do it, just as I've tried to do today. If anybody knows of one, let me know, because that would be a great find, or as I said, thanks for the business idea.
So looking at that, Michelle, thank you for that. Just in terms of your organisation, and that you did go ahead with that, and that the executive had a budget, they had a willingness to make the investment. And some of our viewers have voted on this question, curious about all of that. What was the sort of I guess not so much the rationale, because that's more obvious, but what was the aha moment for the exec when they said, we're going to put this money, we're going to have this pervasive approach and make sure that we're actually doing things possibly the other way around, channels plus culture, content afterwards, because we've got to get our platform right? When were the aha moments?
Yeah, so my answer's in a few parts there. The first 2 years of, I guess I'd call it my program, was cost neutral to the organisation. Previous to my arrival at the Commission had one person, and that person was well overworked and only capable of doing a very limited amount of comms. Mm-hmm. But what the organisation was doing was spending a lot of money with comms consultants on projects. And as anyone who has procured those services, you're talking about $20, $30, $40, $60, $100,000 for one piece of work. So the decision was made that we were no longer going to do that. We were not going to have external comms consultants doing that. Because I was still the one person when I arrived, if there was a need that exceeded my capacity, then I would manage that to at least make sure that what was being done was consistent across the organisation. But what we did was we took that money and we put a small team together of 3 people. So that was part one. In terms of getting buy-in, there were 2 main triggers. One was the reputation survey. I call it my Trojan horse. I can come in and I can talk about what I see and what I think, and what I would get back in those early days was very much, oh, but so-and-so rang up and they really like us, so that's evidence we're doing a good job. There was a lot of, I guess, subjective assessment of how we were doing reputation-wise. If we got a letter that complimented a particular piece of work, it was taken as that was representative of all stakeholders. So doing a reputation survey or a stakeholder survey, it's similar to surveys that I've been involved in many roles over the years. It was the only way to objectively measure how our stakeholders felt on a representative level that, took personalities and individuals out of the mix. And the results were quite shocking, particularly if you think back to that table and a couple of the divisions that were almost completely red. So their results were well below the average, and they were pulling down the reputation. I had, I had full support of the CEO. I had full support of some of the executives whose, I guess, their reputation was being dragged down by what was not working in other divisions. So that was one trigger. The third trigger, and probably the most powerful, was a very high profile, important project went very, very horribly wrong. And we had uproar from stakeholders across the board. We had uproar to the point where the minister was getting complaints. And of course, as we all know, when you operate in a, in a world where you are side by side, you know, you have to pay attention to that kind of thing. But, you know, dare I say, I was standing back going, thanks. This was the trigger that I needed. So meanwhile, I'd been working away on a bunch of other stuff. I'd been working on channels. There was no shortage of things to do, but the real mind shift and the buy-in didn't come until we got those survey results and until we had a crisis.
I think with that in mind, I'm going to thank you for that comprehensive answer, Michelle. With that in mind, I'm going to just jump a few questions here, because there is that kind of issue of the nature of the public authority, the connection with the minister, the funding cycle, the electoral cycle. How do you think, with everything that you've just said, that departmental regulators can manage their reputations given that automatic proximity, the automatic proximity to a minister and other agencies, central and local?
We guard our independence fiercely. That's a tricky one. It is something that we have to deal with, but it is something that we answer when we are responding to stakeholders. You know, if we put something out for public consultation and the feedback is tangential to what we do, then we'll be clear that that's not our responsibility, but not in a way that fobs people off. The worst thing you can do to a stakeholder is say, you know, not relevant, not relevant.
Yeah.
Two of my least favourite words are when you respond to genuine stakeholder feedback with not relevant. You can say, this is not within the remit of this decision and not something that we can control. And you just have to constantly reinforce your remit without sounding like you're trying to pass the buck. So it is you have to balance that. And
I guess the carve-outs are naturally inevitable. I mean, the results you've achieved are self-evidently terrific. I guess let's talk about the money. How do they translate into dollars, and to what extent do we need to convince our execs that the time and effort invested in what is worthwhile? I mean, I know it's not all about the money, but you know, in terms of return on investment in that very visible measure.
Yeah, I think that the best people to answer that would be the directors. And going back to my story from before, the decision that went horribly wrong, that was a huge project that 18 months of work had gone into, that had to start all over again. So having comms and engagement, having your reputation, having things go badly costs you in time and effort and angst and stress and all of those things. And again, you know, I'd have to defer to my friends on the executive. They're the ones who tell me that they can't afford to have to restart and go again. And there are efficiencies with having a reputation. You know, we've had occasions where we just need to ask for information and it's given willingly versus having to go through laborious and sometimes legal processes to get information. And I want to give credit to the executive, to my CEO, John Hamill from New Zealand, and to the previous chair of the Essential Services Commission, Ron Ben David, and the current chair, Kate Simons. I've had the most remarkable support within the executive and the commissioners, the board, to drive this change through, because they see the benefits of it. They see that it makes their life easier. They see that we're making, and it's not just about making a life easier, we're making better decisions that are more connected with the community. You know, we're talking about things like vulnerability and climate change and how that matters to our business. We're talking about making sure that, you know, the most vulnerable customers are taken into account when we make a decision. You know, we've come so far. I've used this type of approach, not exactly the same because every organisation is different, but I've used this approach several times now in a number of different organisations. This is the one where everything has fallen into place, and a big part of that has been buy-in at the top level and then building buy-in throughout the organisation.
And I think it's one of those things, thank you for that insight, Michelle, isn't it, that with the COVID overlay, it takes it to an utterly new dimension. What are your thoughts on that?
COVID was a mixed situation for us. On one hand, it helped us fully shift something that we had been trying to push through and weren't quite making progress on, and that was shifting to more online engagement. And we found that when we had to do it, we were doing it really well. And that was because we'd done the engagement training with staff. So we didn't have to train them on how to do good engagement. We just had to upskill on doing good online engagement. So that was a real positive for us. One of the parts of the organisation started doing consumer roundtables, so we knew what was happening on the ground, and that's been a massive benefit for us as an organisation, reputationally speaking, because we were able to demonstrate that we knew what was going on, on the ground with people. But it has made some other things sort of slow down or backslide a little. And we're addressing that now, things like, ramming through plain English training because it's just not as effective online, and, being able to come together and collaborate with teams. So it's been a mixed blessing, I think, but overall, I think that we're well placed for the year ahead.
That's good to hear, Michelle. And in fact, Plain English Foundation, I've just been told by one of our audience, the Plain English Foundation now run online courses, so it is an avenue. Another participant in our audience has said that they wish that there was even 1% chance that everything that you've said could happen in their organisation. So lots of phone calls and emails, I suspect, emanating from this webinar for you, Michelle. Just one more question. We are sort of heading towards the end of a really, really exciting webinar, and I think it's this one. How do regulators, controversial, how do regulators recover when they've just taken a massive hit to their reputations? And subjects of recent and current royal commissions come into play, but I guess it's also the ebb and the flow that any regulator faces in what's essentially potentially a seasonal industry in terms of compliance activity.
Build the wall. Build that wall, one brick at a time.
And without injecting controversy into it, that's possibly a nicer statement to hear from a public figure about building a wall. There are other ones which are not the subject of this webinar. Michelle Bryne, thank you very much indeed.